Hello. This is the second of a series of presentations on modelling the mind using the modular cognition framework, and you may have seen the introduction. If you haven't, then I recommend that you go and look at it, but I will be reprising some of the points I made in this short presentation, which is about sensory perception. Now, in this presentation we'll look at some parts of the basic cognitive system that we share with many other species. In a following presentation we will deal with two more of these, one of which is slightly controversial, but I'll talk about that later. But now we're really considering what I call the portal, the perceptual portal to the outside world, which is the first line of knowledge, if you like, knowledge building, memory making, that exists between the rest of our mind and all the confusion of the signals that bombard us from the outside world, from the immediate environment. Okay, so as I say, today we begin with sensory perception, that is with the senses, of which there are 5 traditionally and also in the current presentation. And if you can imagine this box as your mind, no insult intended here, it's just an abstract box, and the 5 senses are, as it were, windows looking outward and inward, into the inner mind and out to the immediate environment. So that's basically what we're going to be looking at, this window. Now you might say, well, the windows are the eyes, the ears, those are the sense organs, those are the physical organs, that's the hardware which I talked about last time. In this case it's the organs of the senses, the sense organs, and we're not going to be dealing with that. We're going to be dealing with cognition, which is about building up knowledge. So let's assume, for present purposes, 5 senses, but these ones, 4 of them will be very familiar: sight, hearing, smell and taste. And the organs are eyes, ears, nose and tongue respectively. Now the 5th sense, the traditional 5th sense, is the sense of touch, but in line with a general principle of keeping accounts of the mind in line with contemporary views of the brain, we will go along with a more contemporary view of the 5th sense, which is the somatosensory sense. And somatosensory sensation includes touch, but it includes simply the sense we have for the body in space and our relation to it. It's a good idea to talk about this as a complex but single sense, because in neuroscience it is located in the cortex at the top. So there is an area of somatosensory area, cortex, up there, and accordingly we are going to reflect this in our description of the 5th sense. So I called it body or body sense. Right, moving on. These 5 types of sensory experience lead to different types of cognition. In other words, by that I mean different ways of representing what is going on in the outside world. Visual representations are created by the visual system. Auditory representations are created by the auditory system, coming through the ears. The olfactory system, that's the sense of smell, being represented in our minds, is also a different system. And the 4th type of representation are gustatory, that's a taste representations. That's where our, as it were, our taste memories are created and stored and maintained and activated. And fifthly, the somatosensory representations, the body sensations, are represented in the somatosensory system. So there's a difference between the physical systems in the brain, which can be identified in a map of the brain, and the way we're representing the mental or psychological or cognitive version as a system of representing where we've abstracted away from the hardware. So in other words, we have 5 different types of representation stored in 5 specialized systems. They're not all merged together in one sort of globular lump, but they're kept separate, and they remain separate. And in the same way in the brain, neuroscientists can track, can record, can see, can image patterns of activity of between the auditory system, for example, and the visual system, and they can identify them because they are distinct patterns. And in the same way, in our representation of the mind, we have 5 different representations accordingly. Now, each specialized system has the same basic design. What is that design? Well, in the first place, it has a processor. That could be described as a toolbox with special processing principles and building blocks with which you can build, as it were, a representation and store it and activate it and manage it in the course of online processing. How the processors are instantiated in physical brain machinery is quite another matter, of course, certainly not in a nice, neat bubble, but distributed across different locations in the brain. And the second basic component, and there are only 2, is what we would call the store. And in the store, this is where our representations are maintained, and we are seeing it very simply as a kind of box. And again, it won't look like that in your physical brain. And this store is a repository of all these representations, most of which are created as a result of life experience. And they are created and they are stored there and they are activated there. So when, for example, you see an apple, the signal coming in from the environment triggers a representation of that apple, which you have built because you're not born with an idea of what an apple is. You have to kind of create it on experience with apples, and the representation of an apple, a visual apple, for example, a visual representation will be in the visual store, and this will be a sort of the memory of it. And this apple can be activated, and as it were, you can see an apple either when there's an apple in front of you, an apple image, or you can also see an apple by imagining it, or you can see an apple which has been activated from this self-same store when you're dreaming. Here's a little reminder, which is a point I made in the introductory session, is that we are talking about the mind and not the brain. And the great convenience of the mind is that we can describe it simply, a bit like the London Underground, as a network of systems. In the case of the Underground, of course, the systems are stations, but in the mind they are these systems such as the one I've just demonstrated. Each system with a processor and a store. Okay, so each of these, as I say, have a processor. There they are, they're all different. The processors operate on different principles, that's why they're separate, and they create different types of representations, and they put them in their store. So each store is, although each system has a store, the store contains representations of a specific type. If you want an analogy with a digital computer, then you might compare a sound file with a sound representation and a visual file with a visual representation. So an MP3, for example, as opposed to a JPEG. And these are constructed according to different principles. And you can't activate a vision using a sound representation, neither can you activate a sound by activating a visual JPEG. As I say, and as I said earlier, in the first presentation, we mustn't go too far with comparing the brain with a digital computer. So each system is a specialized system. It's an expert system. It has its own function, and that's indeed why we call it expert. So the result is that each processor builds, stores and activates its own recognizably different type of representation. For example, we represent what we hear differently from what we see. We represent the sound of an apple different from the image of an apple. But of course, these systems can't float around in mental space completely disconnected from anything else. They have to have ways of interacting and collaborating with other systems. That's why we chose the metaphor of the London Underground, because you could portray it as a system of, in this case, railway lines connecting all the three stations. In the case of the mind, they're systems which have interfaces which can interact with one another. So processors and stores are viewed as separate entities, but they are connected by interfaces. And what is the result of this is that particular representations of different types can be associated in this way. For example, we've got here three different systems. We've got an auditory system on your left, in the middle we've got a visual system, and on the right we've got a gustatory system. And more specifically, we've got three stores represented there. In the stores you find a particular sound representation, a particular visual representation, and a particular taste representation, and these are then linked the one with the other so that they are associated. And the result is, if you activate one of them, then the other two are also activated. This is the equivalent of the brain principle of things that are wired together, fire together. So if we go back to our view of an apple, if we see an apple, we may have a strong visual image in our heads, but at the same time the sound of a crunch as you bite through an apple and the taste of an apple will also be activated. And in that way, of course, when you see an apple and you're particularly hungry, then of course you might start salivating. Okay, so if we now, instead of lining them up neatly in a kind of military row, arrange them around in a circle, the processors and the stores of the different five systems, we can perhaps see them as a sort of portal with the outside world, with the inside of the circle being the inner sanctum of the mind, as it were, and the outside space round the circle being the outside environment. And although each one is connected up with the one next to it, as it were, they're also interconnected with all the others. So it's a very tightly connected system, and everything tends to interact with everything else. So you can imagine, in order to survive in the world from millisecond to millisecond, this system of perceptual systems is constantly being activated, and the implication of that we will get to later. But in specifically at the very next presentation will be about meanings and values, and these two things are the other two systems which I said that we share with other animals. The meaning one is a little controversial, but the value system is definitely something we share with many other species, and it also is the part of the mind which is responsible for emotions. And with that, and a promise of interesting things next time, I'll now conclude the presentation. Thank you very much. Oh, by the way, a little plug, I suppose. If you're interested in reading up about this, all of it so far, perhaps apart from one or two publications, has been specifically to do with language. And the reason for that is not only that me and my collaborator John Truscott are particularly interested in language, and this is our area of specialization, is that the fascinating thing about language is that it connects up with the rest of the mind. So there's not just a little language bit in your mind. It actually, as you use language, it's activating and heavily linked up with all the other systems in the mind. So it's particularly interesting from that point of view, and it's also interesting, of course, because it's a particularly human characteristic and makes us stand out from other species in that respect. And a number of books have been produced. But that's all in our webpage, cognitionframework.com. You don't have to bother about that. So I'll just conclude with a normal goodbye, and hope to see you next time.